You need a home, I need a wife. That's what the mountain man declared in the middle of a snow-whipped street. To a homeless, shivering girl the town had already judged. Folks thought it was pity. Some thought it was madness. But when she stepped into his cabin, she stepped into a war one no one warned her about, a banker with a smile sharper than a knife, a railroad that would tear up every root in the valley, even the spring that kept life in both settler and tribal. Home, and a past she thought she'd bury dragged into the light, ready to be used against her. She can cook, she can hunt, but can she stand beside a man willing to fight the whole town for what's right? Snow falls, church bells echo, wagon wheels creak on frozen roads. Time is running out before the land and their future are gone. When the law bends to money and the winter won't let go, will this unlikely pair hold on to the only thing they've found worth keeping, or lose it all before spring thaw? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect, U.S. across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story. To dot the snow fell in thick, lazy flakes, coating Main Street in a blanket of white that muffled the usual bustle of town. Jonas Hale adjusted the heavy sack of flour against his shoulder as he stepped out of Carter's Mercantile. The leather of his boots creaked in the cold as his eyes swept across the street, taking in the scene before him. There, huddled beneath the sagging eaves of Thompson's General Store, sat Abby Carter. Her worn dress, patched in several places, offered little protection against the bitter wind. Her cheeks glowed red from the cold, and she had drawn her knees up close, trying to make herself smaller despite her size. Jonas noticed how she kept her eyes down, avoiding the stares of the townswomen who gathered near the millinery shop. "Lord have mercy, would you look at that Carter girl?" Mrs. Henderson's voice carried across the street, sharp as a whip crack, size of a bear and dressed like a beggar. "She'll be dead by week's end if someone don't take pity," Sarah Mitchell added, with a sniff. "Though who'd want such a burden?" Jonas felt something stir in his chest, a mixture of anger and something else he couldn't quite name. He'd seen Abby around town before, always working hard, always alone since her PA had passed. The whispers followed her everywhere, but she held her head high and did what needed doing, without really meaning to. Jonas found his boots carrying him across the street. The snow crunched beneath each step, and he could feel the eyes of the gossips boring into his back. Abby looked up as his shadow fell across her, fear and defiance warring in her expression. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice steady and clear enough to carry to the watching crowd. "You need a home, I need a wife." The words hung in the frozen air. Abby's mouth fell open slightly, and a gasp rippled through the gathering audience. Jonas stayed still, patient, as he'd learned to be on long hunting trips, while Abby found her voice. I ain't got no money," she stammered, her fingers twisting in her skirts. "No family neither. But I can work hard, Mr. Hale. I know how to keep house and hunt small game." And Jonas shifted the flour sack and shook his head. "Ain't asking for gold, Miss Carter. Just asking if you'd consider it." The wind whistled down Main Street, catching at loose scarves and hat brims. Jonas could see Mrs. Henderson's mouth working like a fish, no sound coming out. Several of the other women had pressed together, whispering furiously behind gloved hands. Abby's eyes searched his face, looking for the trick, the cruel joke that experience had taught her to expect. But Jonas met her gaze steadily, his expression open and honest as the snow-covered mountains beyond the town. Abby started to speak, but a new voice cut through the moment like a knife through butter. "Well, well, what have we here, Milas?" Rudd's polished boots appeared at the edge of Jonas's vision. The banker stood there in his fine wool coat, a smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Hale, making proposals in the street? How romantic. Though perhaps you should focus on more pressing matters." Jonas turned slowly to face him, keeping his expression neutral, despite the tension that crept into his shoulders. "Meaning what?" "Mr. Rudd," Rudd brushed an imaginary speck of snow from his sleeve, "meaning that your land will be seized within the month, unless certain arrangements can be made. The railroad has interests, you understand, and your property's position makes it ... valuable." The crowd had gone silent, watching the exchange with hungry eyes. Jonas felt Abby shift behind him, standing up straighter despite the cold. That land's mine, fair and square, Jonas said quietly. Got the deed to prove it. Deeds can be complicated things, Rudd replied, his smile widening, especially when taxes come due. But we can discuss this like civilized men in my office. No need to air such matters in the street. The threat in his words was clear as mountain water. Jonas stood his ground, aware of Abby's presence behind him, of the watching townsfolk, of the snow continuing to fall around them all. His land, with its precious spring, and the cabin he'd built with his own hands, meant everything. But right now, watching Abby from the corner of his eye as she gathered her courage to stand beside him, he realized maybe it wasn't the only thing that mattered anymore. The snow kept falling, marking them all equal under its clean white blanket, while the future hung uncertain as storm clouds in the winter sky. Jonas offered his arm to Abby as they made their way through the swirling snow toward his wagon. She hesitated for just a moment before taking it, her fingers trembling against his coat sleeve. The banker's words seemed to chase them down the street. Your land will be seized within the month. The wagon creaked as Jonas helped her up onto the wooden seat. He tucked a heavy buffalo robe around her legs, then climbed up beside her. The leather reins felt stiff with cold in his hands as he clucked to the horses. "Thank you," Abby whispered, her voice nearly lost in the wind. She pulled the fur closer, trying to stop her shivering. The town buildings grew smaller behind them. Fading into the white curtain of snow, Jonas cleared his throat. About what Rudd said back there, ... He paused, gathering his thoughts. There's a dispute about the boundary line where my land meets the railroad's claim. They say I owe back taxes on a piece I've worked these past 3 years. Abby studied his profile, noting the worry lines around his eyes. Is it true? About the seizure? Rudd's got papers that show different markers than my deed. Jonas's jaw tightened. Railroad's been pushing hard for that land. Spring water there never freezes, even in the worst winter. The wagon wheels crunched through fresh snow. They passed the frozen creek where ice had formed fantastic shapes along the banks. In the distance, a lone rider moved like a shadow against the white landscape, then disappeared into the falling snow. Maybe, ... Abby swallowed hard. Maybe I shouldn't come with you if the land might be lost. Jonas turned to look at her then, his eyes serious. It's warmer under a roof, he said simply. No matter what comes. They traveled in silence after that, the horse's breath steaming in the cold air. Finally, through the curtain of snow, Abby saw the dark shape of a cabin nestled among tall pines. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, promising warmth within . Jonas helped her down from the wagon, then led her to the cabin door. Inside, the smell of wood smoke and cured hides wrapped around them like a blanket. A pot-bellied stove squatted. In one corner, its belly glowing red through the iron grates. "Make yourself at home," Jonas said, shrugging off his snow-covered coat. He moved to the stove, where a coffee pot waited. "I'll get this hot again." Abby stood near the stove, holding her hands out to the warmth. Her eyes took in the simple furniture, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair draped with a wolfskin, shelves lined with provisions. Everything spoke of careful work, of a life built piece by piece. "There's a small room in the loft," Jonas said, pouring coffee into tin cups. "It ain't much, but it's private." Abby climbed the ladder to the loft, carrying her small bundle. The space was tight but clean, with a narrow window that looked out on the snow-covered valley. She unpacked her belongings to worn dresses, carefully folded. A patchwork quilt her mother had made, and her father's Bible, its pages soft with use. When she came back down, Jonas had set out their supper, a pot of beans and fresh bread he must have bought in town. They ate quietly, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against bowls, and the wind in the pines outside, far off in the gathering dark. Wolves began to howl. Abby shivered, but not from cold this time. The sound spoke of wild things, of dangers, and decisions that couldn't be undone. She looked across the table at Jonas, this quiet man who had offered her shelter when others only offered scorn. "The wolves don't come near the cabin," Jonas said, as if reading her thoughts. "They just remind us they're out there." Abby nodded, understanding he meant more than just the wolves. There were other threats circling. Silas Rudd with his papers, and promises, the railroad with its iron tracks and greed, but bitter cold of a winter spent along. But here in this cabin, with its walls of squared logs and its roof of split shakes, She felt something she hadn't known in a long time, the beginning of hope, beginning of hope. The snow continued to fall outside, and the wolves sang their ancient songs to the darkening sky. Inside, the stove ticked as it cooled, and to people who had been alone too long, shared the warmth of a fire and the comfort of company, while tomorrow waited beyond the dawn. Dawn crept over the mountain valley, painting frost patterns on the cabin windows. The pale winter light filtered through the ice-rimmed panes, casting weak shadows across the wooden floor. Jonas rose from his bed before the sun fully emerged. Pulling on his heavy boots and wool coat, outside, his breath clouded in the crisp morning air as he approached the woodpile. The rhythmic thunk of his axe, splitting logs, echoed across the snow-covered yard. Inside, Abby stirred at the sound, grateful for the lingering warmth from the banked fire. She climbed down from the loft and went straight to the stove, adding kindling and stoking the embers back to life. The coffee pot soon bubbled, filling the cabin with its rich aroma. When Jonas came in with an armload of split wood, she had a steaming cup ready. "Much obliged," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "Been a while since someone thought to pour my coffee." Abby wrapped her shawl tighter and gestured to the shelves. "I saw you have eggs and salt pork stored. I could fix us some breakfast if you'd like." Jonas nodded, settling into a chair by the stove. The sizzle of pork in the cast iron pan and the crack of eggs filled the comfortable silence between them. When Abby set a plate before him, the food was perfectly cooked. "This seizure business," she said carefully, sitting down with her own plate. "What can be done about it?" Jonas pushed his eggs around thoughtfully. "There's a spring in the valley. Below never freezes, even in the coldest winter. My cabin depends on Itund, so does Elena's family, Elena, Ute matriarch. Her people have used that spring for generations." He took a slow sip of coffee. "Railroad's been pushing hard for water rights all through these parts." Abby leaned forward. "And the tax claim seems mighty convenient, don't it?" Jonas set his cup down. "Need to check with the clerk about those boundaries. Might as well head into town for supplies too." By mid-morning, they were ready to leave. Jonas helped Abby into his old buffalo coat before they climbed into the wagon. The heavy fur swallowed her, but it kept the biting wind at bay as they drove toward town. The courthouse stood stern and gray against the winter sky. Inside, the clerk's office was warm but unwelcoming. The young man behind the desk shuffled through papers nervously when Jonas asked about the tax claim. "Well, you see, Mr. Hale," the clerk glanced at the door as if wishing to escape. "The thing is, the railroads surveyed that whole section for a new line. They're saying the spring falls on their side of the boundary." Abby watched Jonas's shoulders stiffen and the taxes. The clerk wouldn't meet his eyes. Just a formality, really. A way to clear the title before construction begins. They left the courthouse in grim silence. Jonas helped Abby back into the wagon, his movements sharp with anger. As they drove home, they passed a woman walking along the snowy path. She wore a beautifully beaded deerskin dress and carried herself with quiet dignity. "Elena," Jonas called out, pulling the wagon to a stop. The woman approached, her dark eyes taking in Abby's presence with gentle curiosity. "Jonas," Elena said warmly, "the winter treats you well. Well enough." He gestured to Abby. "This here's Abby Carter, my wife." Elena's smile deepened. "Welcome to the valley, sister." She touched her heart in greeting, and Abby found herself returning the gesture. The exchange was brief. But Abby noticed the easy respect between Jonas and Elena. There was history there, built on trust and mutual understanding. As they continued home, Abby thought about the spring that connected their lives, about water that refused to freeze even in the depths of winter. Evening found them back in the cabin. Jonas added logs to the fire while Abby prepared a simple supper. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, but neither spoke. The weight of what they'd learned at the courthouse hung heavy in the air. Outside, the wind whispered through pine boughs. Carrying winter's chill and the distant sound of wolves, they sat before the fire, each lost in thought. The railroad's plan to seize the land wasn't just about taxes or boundary lines, it was about power, about who controlled the lifeblood of the valley. Abby watched Jonas's face in the firelight, seen the worry etched there, and wondered what tomorrow would bring. Snow drifted down in thick, lazy flakes, coating the valley in another layer of white. Inside the barn, Jonas wrestled with a broken latch, his fingers stiff from the cold as he worked the metal pieces back into place. The worn wood had split, making the repair more difficult than expected. Still, the familiar work settled him after yesterday's troubling news from town. In the cabin, Abby sat near the window where the weak winter light helped her mending. Her nimble fingers worked a neat line of stitches along the torn sleeve of one of Jonas's work shirts. A small pile of clothes lay beside her, shirts with missing buttons, torn cuffs, and frayed collars. The steady rhythm of needle and thread brought a peace she hadn't felt in months. "These should hold better now," she called out when Jonas came in to warm himself by the stove. She held up a newly mended shirt for his inspection. "Ain't had proper mending done in a long while," he said, rubbing his cold hands together. "Much obliged." Their quiet afternoon was interrupted by a knock at the door. Alina stood on the threshold, snowflakes dusting her dark hair. Behind her, a young boy of perhaps 10 years peered around her skirts with curious eyes. "Welcome, Jonas," said, stepping back to let them in. "Come get warm." Alina introduced her grandson, Thomas, who carried a cloth-wrapped package. "We brought smoked venison," she said, to welcome the new wife. Abby felt her cheeks warm at the kindness. "Please, let me make some tea." She busied herself with the kettle, setting out the few cups they owned, while Jonas and Alina spoke quietly by the fire. Soon they all sat together. The venison shared among them on a worn plate. Thomas sat cross-legged on the floor, watching the adults with bright eyes as he nibbled on his portion. The cabin filled with the comfort of shared food and warmth. "The spring," Alina said after a while, her voice soft but clear. "It has been sacred to my people since before the first treaties. The waters there have healing properties. This is known to all who live in the valley." She touched the beaded necklace at her throat. "When the government men came with their papers, they promised the spring would be protected. They wrote it in their words, spoke it with their mouths." Abby leaned forward, something stirring in her mind. "These treaties, they're legal documents, aren't they? With specific protections written down." Alina nodded. "So we were told. But papers can be lost, promises forgotten." "Unless someone remembers," Abby said quietly. "Unless someone fights to hold those promises true." The afternoon light was fading when Alina and Thomas left, leaving behind the remainder of the venison. And much to think about. Abby stood in the doorway, watching their figures disappear into the swirling snow, understanding now that this fight was about more than just one cabin or one family's claim to the land. As evening settled in, Jonas lit the lamp while Abby cleared away the teacups. The warm lamplight cast a gentle glow through the cabin, making shadows dance on the rough-hewn walls. They sat at the small table, the remains of their simple supper pushed aside. "I've been thinking," Abby said, her hands clasped before her. "What if we gathered signatures from the townsfolk? Surely there are others who don't want the railroad pushing through wherever they please." Jonas's face grew troubled. "Folks don't much like taking sides against big money. Railroads got powerful friends. But they've got neighbors too," Abby insisted. "Elena's family, your cabin, the spring itself, it all matters. Maybe, if enough, people stood together." Jonas studied her face in the lamplight. "Could be dangerous, taking on the railroad. Might lose everything anyway." "We might," Abby agreed. "But I reckon some things are worth fighting for, even if you lose." Her voice grew stronger. "I want to help, Jonas. Let me do this much at least." Something shifted in Jonas's expression, surprise, perhaps, or respect. After a long moment, he nodded. "All right then, we'll try it your way." Before heading to bed, Jonas pulled on his coat. "Need to check the traps in the barn," he said, pausing at the door. "Storm's coming in strong tonight, can feel it in the air." Abby climbed up to her loft room, listening to the wind as it picked up strength outside. The old boards creaked beneath her feet as she changed into her nightdress. Through the small window, she could see the snow falling faster now, the flakes dancing wildly in the growing darkness. From below came the sound of Jonas returning, the soft thud of his boots being removed, the familiar creak of his chair by the fire. Strange, she thought, how quickly these small sounds had become a comfort. Strange, too, how this fight for the valley had given her a purpose she hadn't known she needed. The wind whistled through the trees outside, but Abby felt warm and certain in her decision. Whatever came next, she would face it alongside Jonas, standing up for what was right. Morning brought the promised storm, its fury transforming the valley into a world of whirling white. The wind howled through the pine trees, driving snow against the cabin windows in thick sheets. Inside, Abby stirred the fire back to life while Jonas pulled on his heavy coat. "Got to clear a path," he said, reaching for the shovel by the door. "Animals need tending, Storm, or no?" Abby nodded, already measuring oatmeal into the pot. "I'll have breakfast ready when you come back in." Through the frost-covered window, she watched Jonas's broad figure move through the deepening snow. His shoulders hunched against the biting wind. The shovel rose and fell in a steady rhythm as he carved a path toward the barn. Her hands moved automatically, stirring the bubbling oatmeal while her mind wandered to the petition they would need to write, the words that might convince their neighbors to stand with them. When Jonas returned, snow-crusted on his beard and coat, the warmth of the cabin wrapped around him like a blanket. Steam rose from the bowls Abby set on the table, the oatmeal sweetened with the last of their molasses. They ate in comfortable silence, listening to the storm rage outside. "No going anywhere today," Jonas said, pushing his empty bowl aside. He retrieved his carving tools from a shelf and spread them on the table. From a pile of wood by the stove, he selected several straight pieces suitable for trap steaks. Abby gathered her mending and settled in the chair by the window. The light, though dim, was enough to work by a familiar motion of needle and thread, brought back memories of other storms. Other times, when the weather had forced stillness upon busy hands, reminds me of winters in the Rockies, Jonas said after a while, his knife moving steadily across the wood. "Used to trap with my PA up near Pike's Peak. Storm like this would hit. We'd be holed up in our cabin for days. Sometimes were you afraid?" Abby asked, looking up from her sewing. A slight smile touched Jonas's lips, not with Pa there. He knew. Those mountains, like his own hand, taught me everything. Tracking, trapping, reading, whether his knife paused. Lost him to pneumonia 6 winters back. Abby's hands stilled in her lap. "My PA and I traveled west when I was 12, she offered, quietly. He had dreams of finding gold in California. Never made it past Colorado territory. She threaded her needle again, the motion helping steady her voice. He was accused of stealing horses, wasn't true, but truth didn't matter much to some. Folks died in jail before they found the real thieves. Jonas's eyes met hers across the table, understanding in their depths. No words were needed. They both knew the weight of loss, the way it shaped a person's path. The day passed slowly, marked by the steady scratch of Jonas's knife against wood and the whisper of Abby's thread through cloth. Outside, the storm gradually began to ease, the wind's howl softening to a moan. Near dusk, Jonas pulled his coat on again. "Animals'll need extra feed in this weather," he said, heading out into the growing darkness. When he returned, snow dusted his shoulders like stars. The cabin had grown warm and fragrant. Abby had turned the morning's venison into a thick stew, letting it simmer all afternoon with dried herbs and the last of their potatoes. Jonas hung his coat by the fire and breathed in deeply. "Smells good," he said, his voice gruff with what might have been shyness. After the first bite, he added quietly, "Tastes even better." Abby felt warmth spread through her chest at the praise. They ate slowly, savoring both the food and the shelter from the storm. When the bowls were empty, Jonas spread the territory map on the table between them. "Reckon we can ride into town day after tomorrow, if the weather holds," he said, tracing the trail with his finger. "I know some folks might listen, if we explain about the spring, about Elena's people." Abby nodded, already composing the petition. In her mind, "We'll need to be careful with the wording," she said. "Make it clear we're protecting something that belongs to all of us." They talked until the fire burned low, planning their approach, considering who might sign first, who might need more convincing. Finally, Jonas rose to bank the fire for the night, carefully arranging the logs to hold warmth until morning. Upstairs in her loft room, Abby knelt beside her narrow bed. The rough floorboards pressed against her knees as she bowed her head in prayer. "Lord," she whispered into the darkness, "give us strength for what's ahead. Help us protect this land and the people who call it home." She paused, listening to the soft crackle of the banked fire below, the last whispers of the dying storm. "And thank you," she added softly, "for bringing me here." 2 days after the storm, Brilliant sunlight sparkled across unblemished snow. The world seemed renewed, though the temperature remained bitter. Jonas and Abby worked together in the crisp morning air, hitching the team to the wagon. Their breath came out in white puffs as they settled the harnesses and checked the traces. "Roads be rough," Jonas said, helping Abby up onto the wagon seat. He tucked a thick buffalo robe around her legs before climbing up beside her. "Might take twice as long as usual." Abby clutched the petition papers inside her coat, keeping them safe and dry. The horses' hooves crunched through the fresh snow as Jonas guided them down the valley trail. The wagon wheels creaked and groaned, fighting through deep drifts. Twice they had to stop while Jonas cleared fallen branches from their path. To town they paused in a sheltered hollow to let the horses catch their breath. The animals stood with heads lowered, steam rising from their flanks. Abby stamped her feet to keep warm, while Jonas checked the horses' legs for snow buildup. "You sure about this?" Jonas asked, brushing snow from one horse's fetlock. "Someone has to stand up," Abby replied, her voice firm despite her chattering teeth. "This valley's worth fighting for." They reached town by mid-morning. The street was quiet, most folks still digging out from the storm. Jonas tied the team outside the mercantile, their first stop. Inside, the owner, Mr. Peterson, listened carefully to their explanation about the spring and the railroad's plans. "Always figured something like this might happen," he said, taking the pen Abby offered. "Railroad men, been sniffing around for months." His signature flowed across the paper, the first name on their list. The blacksmith proved equally supportive. "That spring's watered half the valley's horses for 20 years, he declared, adding his name with soot-stained fingers. "Railroad can find another route." But at the pastor's house, they met their first resistance. The Reverend shifted uncomfortably in his doorway, eyes darting between them and the street. "Now, I understand your concern," he said, "but siding with the Indians against progress, ... He shook his head. "I'm sorry, but I can't put my name to this." The door closed firmly in their faces. Abby's shoulders slumped slightly, but she straightened them again as they walked on. Outside the general store, while Jonas stepped inside to speak with the owner, Abby waited by the hitching post. Two women in fine wool coats passed nearby, their voices carrying clearly in the cold air. "Did you hear? That Carter girl, the one whose father was the horse thief, living out there with Hale now, Lord above. Yes. Size of her, she probably ate him out of house and home already." Abby's face burned, but she kept her eyes forward, refusing to acknowledge their words. When Jonas emerged, he took in her rigid posture and the retreating women. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing, simply helped her back into the wagon. Continued their rounds through town, collecting signatures where they could. Some townspeople signed eagerly, others refused outright. By early afternoon, they had gathered 12 names. Not as many as they'd hoped, but a start. The sun was lowering when they turned the wagon toward home, making one final stop at Elena's lodge. The Ute woman welcomed them inside, out of the biting wind. The lodge was warm, smelling of pine smoke and dried herbs. Elena listened intently as they explained their progress. "The spring has witnessed many seasons," she said, taking the pen. "It has seen the buffalo come and go, watched children grow old. It must remain free." She signed her name in careful letters, then spoke something in her own language to her grandson, who nodded solemnly. "What did she say?" Abby asked, as they prepared to leave. "That water knows no boundaries," Elena replied. "Like truth, it flows where it will." She pressed a small bundle of dried meat into Abby's hands. "Keep fighting. The ancestors are watching." Back in the wagon, Jonas and Abby's hands were stiff, with cold despite their gloves. The setting sun painted the snow-covered valley in shades of pink and gold as they made their way home. Neither spoke much, both thinking of the day's mixed results, the encouraging support of some, the cold rejection of others, and the weight of the task still ahead. Elena's words echoed in Abby's mind as she watched the familiar shape of Jonas's cabin emerge from the gathering dusk. The spring might know no boundaries, but people built them anyway. Between neighbors, between races, between what was right and what was easy. She tucked the precious petition papers, with their dozen signatures, deeper inside her coat. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold as Jonas pulled on his heavy coat and stepped out into the crisp morning air. His boots crunched through fresh snow as he made his way to the woodpile. The splitting maul felt familiar in his calloused hands as he set to work, each swing precise and purposeful. Inside the cabin, Abby kneaded bread dough on the flour-dusted table. The rhythmic thud of Jonas's axe kept time with her movements as she worked the dough, adding pinches of precious salt. The cabin filled with warmth from the cook stove and the promising smell of fresh bread. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the morning's steady rhythm. Jonas paused, maul raised, watching as a rider emerged from the trees. Abby wiped her, hands on her apron, and moved to the window, flour streaking her sleeve. The rider wore a black coat and wide-brimmed hat that marked him as a preacher. He reined his horse to a stop near the cabin, and Jonas set down his maul, nodding a cautious greeting. "Morning," the visitor called out. "Pastor Miller from over Silver Creek way." He dismounted stiffly, looking between Jonas and Abby, who had stepped onto the porch. The pastor's eyes widened with recognition. "Why, if it isn't Thomas Carter's girl," he said, removing his hat. "Been years since your PA's trouble over in Willow Creek." Abby's shoulders tensed, her fingers twisted in her apron as the pastor continued, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Such a shame about those horse theft accusations. Never did. Believed Thomas would steal. Myself. Good man, your father." He shook his head. "Town council wouldn't hear reason, though, would they? Ran him clear out of the territory." Jonas watched Abby's cheeks flame red, her eyes fixed on the ground. The pastor seemed not to notice her discomfort as he turned to Jonas. "Came to warn you about the railroad survey crew. They're marking lines through these parts next week." He mounted his horse, settling his hat back on his head. "Might want to prepare yourself." After the pastor rode away, silence hung heavy between them. Abby turned toward the door, but Jonas's quiet words stopped her. "Don't matter to me what they said about your pa," he said, his voice firm. "Man's worth ain't measured by town gossip." Abby nodded once, disappearing inside to check her bread. Jonas returned to his woodcutting, his swings perhaps a bit harder than before. Later that day, they hitched the wagon for the trip to town. The railroad had called a meeting at the courthouse, and half the valley had turned out. Abby and Jonas found seats near the back. Aware of the whispers and sideways glances, the railroad's lawyer, a sharp-featured man in an Eastern suit, stood at the front of the room. His voice carried with practiced authority as he outlined the company's plans for the valley. When he noticed Jonas and Abby in the crowd, his thin lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. "I understand some of you have concerns about our proposed route," he said, lifting a familiar paper. "This petition, for instance, though I question the ... reliability of its supporters," his gaze fixed on Abby, "particularly when they include known associates of thieves. The daughter of Thomas Carter, for example. Apple doesn't fall far from the tree, they say." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Abby sat perfectly still, her face pale. "Seems to me," the lawyer continued, "only trash would side with savages against progress." The scrape of Jonas's chair cut through the room as he stood, his height impressive even from the back. His voice, though quiet, carried clearly. "Mind your tongue, lawyer," he said, each word measured and cold as winter steel. "Unless you aim to lose it." The threat hung in the air like frost. The lawyer's face flushed, but he swallowed whatever reply he'd planned. The meeting ended shortly after, with nothing resolved. The ride home passed in silence. Evening settled over the valley, bringing with it a bitter wind. Inside the cabin, Abby moved through her chores mechanically, barely touching her supper. Jonas sat in his chair by the fire, the steady scrape of whetstone on knife blade the only sound. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as Abby finally sank into the other chair. She stared into the fire, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Jonas continued his work, the knife's edge gleaming sharper with each careful stroke. Neither spoke, but the silence between them had shifted, becoming something more like understanding. The week crawled by like molasses in winter. Jonas rose before dawn each morning, hitching up the wagon to haul hay from the McKinnon place, 3 miles north. Abby's needle flashed in the lamplight as she worked on mending and sewing orders. Some townsfolk still trusted her skills, even if they whispered behind her back. She took pride in each straight seam, each careful stitch, grateful for the work that helped keep food on their table. "Much obliged," Mrs. Peterson said quietly, when she collected her repaired quilt, pressing $2 into Abby's palm. "Don't mind what some folks say. Your stitching's the finest in the territory." Their petition grew longer with each passing day. The smith's wife signed, then the cooper and his family. Even old William Barnes, who'd lived in the valley 40 years, added his shaky mark. But for every name they gained, the railroad's presence grew more threatening. One crisp afternoon, Abby walked to the spring to fetch water, wound through stands of aspen, their leaves rattling like whispered prayers in the breeze. As she approached the water, voices carried through the trees. She slowed, listening. Alina stood by the spring, her gray hair bound in neat braids, facing down a railroad surveyor. The man planted his transit tripod aggressively close to the water's edge. "This spring's marked for railroad use," he said, not looking up from his instruments. "You folks'll need to find water elsewhere." "These waters have nourished my people since before your grandfathers were born," Alina replied, her voice steady as stone. "The treaty protects them." "Treaties change," the surveyor sneered, making another mark in his notebook. Alina didn't move. "The water remains." She stood like an ancient tree, rooted to the earth, until the surveyor finally gathered his equipment and stalked away. That evening, after supper, Jonas sat at the table cleaning his rifle. The familiar motions couldn't hide the worry in his features. "Reckon the council's already in the railroad's pocket," he said quietly, working oil into the wood. "Saw Banker Rudd meeting with their lawyer yesterday." Money talks louder than right. Abby set aside her mending and moved to the stove to pour fresh coffee. The rich aroma filled the cabin as she placed a cup near Jonas's hand. "Maybe so," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "But that don't mean we stop fighting. Truth's got power too, even when folks try to bury it." Jonas's hands stilled on the rifle. He looked up, meeting her steady gaze. "You still got hope then? Hope's free?" she replied with a small smile. "And we've got nothing to lose by speaking up at the council vote." He nodded slowly, returning to his work. "We'll go together then, day after tomorrow." The day before the meeting dawned cold and clear. Jonas spent the morning splitting the last of the wood, the steady rhythm of his axe echoing through the valley. Abby watched from the doorway as he stacked the split logs under the eaves, building up the pile higher than usual. "Preparing for siege?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. Jonas drove his axe into the chopping block and straightened, rolling his shoulders. "Figure we best be ready, whatever comes." He looked toward the spring, where survey stakes now dotted the ground like bones. Railroad men don't give up easy when there's profit to be had. Neither do folk protecting their home. "No," he agreed. "Reckon they don't." They spent the rest of the day preparing for the council meeting. Abby wrapped up her sewing orders and gathered their documentation. The petition, Elena's copy of the treaty, the original land grant papers. Jonas checked the wagon, greasing the wheels and examining the harness for wear, as evening settled over the valley. They shared a simple supper of beans and cornbread. The familiar sounds of night creatures stirred in the darkness outside, an owl's haunting call. The yip of coyotes in the distance. Inside, lamplight cast warm shadows on the walls of the cabin. They both now thought of as home, much their thoughts on tomorrow's confrontation. But when Jonas rose to bank the fire for the night, his hand brushed Abby's shoulder briefly, a touch that carried more comfort than words could have managed. Later, lying in her loft bed, Abby listened to the quiet creaking of the cabin settling in the cold. Below, she could hear Jonas's steady breathing. She offered up a silent prayer, not for victory exactly, but for the strength to stand firm. In the face of whatever tomorrow might bring, the town hall's wooden benches creaked. Under the weight of what seemed like half the county, oil lamps cast flickering shadows on the whitewashed walls, and the smell of wet wool and wood smoke hung heavy in the air. Abby clutched the petition in her gloved hands, trying to still their trembling as she sat beside Jonas in the front row. Mayor Thompson's gavel struck wood, council meetings now in session. First matter the proposed railroad extension through Hale Valley. The railroad lawyer, Mr. Barstow, rose from his seat, silk vest gleaming in the lamplight. His voice dripped with false courtesy. "Gentlemen of the council, progress waits for no man. This line will bring prosperity to all." He gestured broadly. Jobs, commerce, connection to the wider world. And what of those who already call the valley home? Jonas's deep voice cut through the murmuring crowd. He stood, shoulders square, meeting the council's eyes. We've gathered signatures from folks who depend on that spring. Abby handed him the petition, their fingers brushing briefly. She watched as he carried it forward, laying the pages before the council. The names filled 3 sheets, each signature representing a family's livelihood. These are your neighbors, Jonas continued. Ranchers, farmers, good people who've worked this land for years, that spring feeds their stock, waters their crops. Elena rose then, her dignified presence drawing all eyes. Her dark shawl wrapped tight against the evening chill, she spoke with quiet authority. The spring has sustained life in this valley since before any of us walked here. Our treaties promised its protection. She withdrew a folded document from her shawl. The words are here, written by your own government. Councilman Peters leaned forward, adjusting his spectacles. The lady speaks true. That treaty's registered with the territorial office? Mr. Barstow's smile tightened. Treaties can be amended. Progress demands progress. Abby found herself on her feet, voice stronger than she'd expected. There's no progress in destroying what sustains us. That spring gives life to the whole valley. The railroad can find another route. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Councilman Webb nodded slowly, and Mayor Thompson studied the petition with unusual care. For a breathless moment, hope flickered in Abby's chest. She saw it reflected in Jonas's eyes as he returned to sit beside her. The meeting stretched on, more folks speaking for and against. Finally, Mayor Thompson cleared his throat. We'll take this matter under advisement. Council will vote in the morning. Meeting adjourned, people filed out into the chill night air. Lamplight from the town hall spilled across the muddy street, catching the frost gathering on fence posts and wagon wheels. Abby paused on the steps, drawing her shawl closer. Jonas stopped beside her, his breath making clouds in the cold. You spoke well in there, he said quietly. As did you. She looked up at him, seeing something soft in his expression that made her heart skip. Abby, his voice was rough. I'm glad I asked you that day, in front of the store. He turned to face her fully. Never thought I'd be grateful for Silas Rudd's threats, but they brought you here. The lamplight caught the silver threading through his dark hair, the lines at the corners of his eyes. Abby felt warmth bloom in her chest, despite the freezing air. I'm glad you asked too. Jonas stepped closer, one calloused hand rising to touch her cheek. She leaned into the touch, and then his lips found hers, gentle as spring rain. The kiss lasted only a moment, but it held the promise of more dawns shared, more quiet evenings by the fire, more moments of understanding without words. They drove home beneath stars, sharp as broken glass, the wagon wheels creaking through fresh fallen snow. Neither spoke much, but the silence felt comfortable, filled with unspoken hope. Morning brought a different kind of silence. Abby was at the stove, turning corn cakes in the skillet, when hoofbeats approached. Jonas opened the cabin door. To find young Tommy Wells from the telegraph office, his pony's sides heaving from the hard ride. Council voted at sunrise, Tommy announced, holding out an official envelope. Mayor Thompson said to deliver this straight away. Jonas took the envelope, his face growing still as he read. Abby set down her spatula, heart pounding. They approved it, he said finally, voice flat. Railroad gets right of way through the valley. Work crews start in 3 days. The paper crumpled in his fist. Abby steadied herself against the table, the sweet smell of burning corn cakes filling the cabin. All their work, all their hopes, undone in a single morning's vote. Money talks louder than right, Jonas said bitterly, echoing his words from days before. Guess you were wrong about truth having power. No. Abby moved to take his clenched fist between her hands. Truth's still truth, whether folks choose to hear it or not, and this ain't finished. He looked down at their joined hands, his fingers slowly relaxing. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady. Covering the survey stakes that marked where their world was about to change, Jonas's boots wore a path across the cabin's plank floor, back and forth like a caged mountain lion. The morning light caught the silver at his temples as he muttered, each turn bringing him past the rifle mounted above the fireplace. His calloused fingers twitched, reaching toward it more than once. 3 days, he growled, pausing to stare out the frost-trimmed window. 3 days till they come to destroy everything we've built. His hand strayed again toward the rifle. Reckon I could thin their numbers some before they, Jonas. Abby's voice quavered as she stepped between him and the fireplace. That's not the way, he turned, eyes dark with fury. Then what is stand by while they take it all? His fist slammed against the window frame. Watch them poison the spring, drive Elena's people from their homes. Abby's heart ached at the pain in his voice. She'd never seen him so close to breaking. Following him as he stalked outside into the crisp morning air, she caught his arm. Please, don't throw your life away like this. Jonas shrugged her off, pacing the yard between cabin and barn. Fresh snow crunched beneath his boots. What's my life worth if I can't protect what matters? It matters to me, Abby said softly. The wind caught her skirts, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke to Elena's family. To everyone who signed that petition, she stepped closer. Violence won't save the spring. It'll just leave more folks grieving. Jonas's shoulders remained rigid, but his steps slowed. He stood looking out across the valley, where survey stakes marked the railroad's intended path like grave markers. In the snow, the sun climbed higher, setting the frost to sparkling. But he barely seemed to notice the cold dot. As evening drew in, Abby lit the lamps and stirred the fire. Jonas had finally come inside but sat brooding in his chair, cleaning his rifle with mechanical precision. The familiar click and scrape of the ramrod filled the quiet cabin. Abby's knees creaked as she knelt beside her bed in the loft. Hands clasped, she didn't lower her voice as she usually did for her evening prayers, letting the words carry down to where Jonas sat below. Lord, she began, we need your wisdom now. Show us a better path than violence. Her voice grew stronger. Give us eyes to see what we might have missed and the patience to seek justice, not vengeance. She paused, hearing the ramrod go still. Grant us mercy, Lord, and show us how to extend it to others, even those who seem to be enemies. The cabin fell silent, save for the pop and hiss of the fire. After a long moment, the sound of Jonas putting away the rifle drifted up through the floorboards. Abby remained on her knees a while longer, adding her private prayers to the ones she'd spoken aloud. Dawn broke clear and cold, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of rose and gold. Abby was just setting fresh coffee on the table when rapid hoofbeats approached. Jonas reached for the rifle, then let his hand fall as Elena's voice called out a greeting. The Ute woman's eyes sparkled with triumph as she swept into the cabin, snow-dusting her dark shawl. I have found something, she announced, withdrawing a leather document case from beneath her wrappings. My grandson rode through the night to bring this from the reservation archives. Abby poured coffee for all three of them while Elena spread the papers on the table. Jonas leaned in, brow furrowed as Elena pointed to a particular section of the treaty. Here, she said, the spring is named specifically, not just as a water source, but as a sacred site. Her finger traced the formal script. Any development that would alter or contaminate its waters must be approved by both tribal council and territorial authorities. Abby bent closer, reading carefully. This is different from the copy they showed at the meeting. She looked up at Elena. This one has additional protections. Jonas straightened, something like hope kindling in his expression. Railroad never got tribal approval, never even asked for it. And they won't get it, Elena said firmly. Our council meets tomorrow. They will formally object to any construction near the spring. Abby studied the treaty clause again, mind working. Quickly, if we take this to the county seat, show them the railroad failed to follow proper procedure. ... She met Jonas's gaze. It could stop them completely. Not just delay things, but block the whole project. The rigid set of Jonas's shoulders had eased. Won't look kindly on the railroad trying to skip steps. The county seat is a day's ride, Elena observed. If you leave soon, you could present this before the work crews arrive. Jonas was already reaching for his coat. We'll take the wagon. Better on these winter roads than saddle horses. He paused, looking at Abby. That is, if you're willing to come, of course. Abby was already gathering provisions for the journey. She caught his hand as she passed, squeezed it once together. The morning sun streamed through the windows as they made their preparations, catching the steam rising from their coffee cups. Outside, Birds called their winter songs, and somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf howled not in threat. But in greeting to the new day, the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky as Jonas and Abby loaded the wagon. Their breath clouded in the frigid air while they secured provisions and extra blankets. Stars still glittered overhead as Jonas helped Abby onto the wooden seat. Abby huddled deeper into the buffalo coat Jonas had insisted she wear, grateful for its warmth, Elena's leather case beneath her feet. Morning light slowly filled the valley as they traveled, revealing a landscape transformed by ice. Every branch and fence post wore a crystalline coating that sparkled like diamonds. "Reckon we should reach Miller's Creek by midday," Jonas said, his quiet voice carrying in the winter silence. "Good place to water the horses." Abby nodded, watching the countryside roll past. Fields lay dormant under their white blanket, and occasionally they glimpsed deer picking their way through the snow-laden trees. The sun climbed higher but provided little warmth against the biting wind. By the time they reached Miller's Creek, their faces were numb despite the scarves wrapped around them. Jonas helped Abby down from the wagon, then led the horses to a spot where the ice was thin enough to break through to the running water below. Here he handed her a tin cup of coffee. From their provisions while the horses drank, they shared a simple meal of bread and jerky, standing close together for warmth. The afternoon's journey seemed longer, the road rougher. Abby found herself studying Jonas's profile as he guided the team, noting how the worry lines around his eyes had deepened these past weeks, determination that gave her hope. The county seat's courthouse loomed ahead just as the sun began its descent, its red brick walls stark against the winter sky. Jonas secured the wagon while Abby gathered Elena's case, her fingers trembling slightly as she clutched it. Inside, the clerk's office was blessedly warm. The young man behind the desk studied the treaty documents with careful attention, occasionally nodding as he compared them to official records. "This clause is quite clear," he finally announced, adjusting his spectacles. "The spring lies within protected Ute territory. Without formal tribal consent, no construction can proceed that might affect the water." He reached for his stamp and official seals. "How many certified copies will you need?" Relief flooded through Abby so strongly her knees nearly buckled. Documents. Darkness had fallen by the time they secured rooms at the Silver Dollar Inn. The simple dinner of beef stew and fresh bread tasted like a feast after their long day. They sat at a corner table, speaking quietly about what would come next. "First light tomorrow, we head back," Jonas said, breaking off a piece of bread. "Should make it home before those work crews arrive." Abby nodded, watching the lamplight play across his weathered features, "and we'll be ready if they don't." The sun stood high overhead as Jonas and Abby's wagon rolled back into town. Fresh snow had fallen during their absence, and the streets were alive with activity as work crews prepared their equipment near the spring site. "Best hurry," Jonas said, helping her down from the wagon. His eyes fixed on the railroad men gathering their tools. Inside the town hall, "Need an emergency council meeting." Now the clerk hesitated, but something in Jonas's expression made him nod. Within the hour, council members filed into the chamber, followed by curious townsfolk. The railroad lawyer, Mr. Barstow, strode in last, his usual smirk fading at the sight of Elena, already seated in the front row. "This is highly irregular," Barstow protested, adjusting his silk tie. "We have a schedule to maintain council." President Thompson raised his hand for silence. "Mr. Hale has brought urgent business." "The floor is yours, sir." Jonas stood, his tall frame commanding attention. "Got here certified copies of the original treaty." He nodded to Abby, who stepped forward with the documents. "Spring's unprotected Ute land. Railroad can't touch it without tribal consent." "Barstow, this is..." For once words failed him. Elena rose gracefully, her silver hair gleaming in the afternoon light through the windows. "The treaty is clear. But I have a proposal." She turned to face Jonas and Abby. "Our peoples have shared this valley in peace. I offer joint stewardship of the spring to you both, binding our families together as one." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Abby felt tears welling in her eyes at the honor being offered. Jonas bowed his head respectfully to Elena. "The law is the law," Thompson declared, studying the treaty copies. "Unless Mr. Barstow's railroad wishes to challenge federal treaties," the lawyer's shoulders slumped. "No, sir, we do not." "Then I call for an immediate vote to halt all construction." Thompson's gavel cracked against the wooden desk. The vote was unanimous. Jonas stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "Much obliged. Alina, your friendship honors us." The words were simple, but his tone carried deep respect. As people began filing out, several townspeople approached Abby. Mrs. Peterson, who had once turned away from her in the mercantile, pressed her hand warmly. "You showed real courage, dear." Other women nodded in agreement, offering smiles where there had once been whispers. Abby stood straighter, feeling Jonas's quiet pride beside her as more folks came forward with congratulations. Through the window, she could see the work crews, already packing up their equipment. Bread? Watching as Abby tucked her skirts beneath her and sat across from him. "Never thought you'd stay," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "That day in town, offering you a home, reckoned you might. Run first chance you got." Abby's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "Truth be told, I wasn't sure myself at first." She set the spoon down, meeting his gaze. "But now, can't imagine being anywhere else." Jonas nodded slowly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Cabin feels right with you here. Like something was missing before, only I didn't know it." Outside, the snow fell harder, hushing. The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing dancing shadows on the walls. Abby reached across the table and touched Jonas's weathered hand. God works in mysterious ways. Sometimes his greatest blessings come disguised as hardship. Over the next few days, they fell into a rhythm preparing for Christmas. Abby spent afternoons in her loft room carefully stitching small gifts, a warm scarf for Alina, soft deerskin moccasins for her grandson, and a new shirt for Jonas, though she kept that one hidden. The familiar motion of needle and thread soothed her soul as she worked. Jonas returned one morning, leading the wagon. A young fir tree laid across the back. "Figured we ought to do Christmas proper," he said, helping Abby position it in the corner. By the hearth, the fresh pine scent filled the cabin, mixing with wood smoke and the spices from Abby's baking. Alina and her family said they'd come Christmas Eve, Abby mentioned, hanging small carved ornaments Jonas had brought up from the root cellar. "She's bringing that sweet, dried berry bread of hers. Jonas stood back, watching Abby arrange pine boughs along the mantel. Never decorated much these past years. Didn't see the point, being alone. He stepped closer, helping her reach a high spot. Different now, though. Everything's different. Now, Abby agreed softly. The peace settling over them felt new, but welcomed, like a warm blanket on a cold night. She looked around the cabin, at the stockings hung by the fire. The small gifts wrapped in brown paper, the tree twinkling with the few glass ornaments Alina had gifted them. For the first time in years, she felt truly at home. Jonas touched her shoulder gently. "Reckon some changes are worth fighting for." Abby leaned into his touch, watching the snow swirl beyond the frosted windows. The cabin creaked softly in the winter wind, but inside, all was warm and still, and right Christmas morning arrived with diamond-bright sunlight, streaming through frost-covered windows. The cabin glowed with warmth from the crackling hearth, where a pot of coffee bubbled welcomingly. Abby had risen before dawn, her hands steady as she prepared the holiday feast. The scent of roasting venison mingled with fresh-baked bread. Filling every corner of their home, Jonas tended the fire, adding another log as he watched Abby move confidently around their small kitchen. Her cheeks were flushed from the heat, and her eyes sparkled with contentment. The wooden floor creaked beneath his boots as he crossed to help her arrange plates on the table. "Smells like heaven itself," he said softly, earning a warm smile from Abby. Near midday, the sound of approaching horses announced Elena's family. Jonas opened the door, letting in a blast of cold air along with their guests. Elena's grandson carried carefully wrapped packages, while her daughter-in-law balanced a basket of pine-scented gifts. "Welcome, Abby," called from beside the stove. Wiping her hands on her apron, come in from the cold, Elena presented them with intricately woven blankets, their patterns telling stories of mountains and rivers. Her grandson offered carved wooden ornaments, delicate birds and stars that caught the lamplight. These they hung carefully on the tree, already decorated with paper chains Abby had made, and the glass. Ornaments from earlier, the cabin filled with the sounds of conversation and laughter as they gathered around the table. Steam rose from bowls. of tender venison and roasted root vegetables. Fresh bread, still warm from the oven, was passed from hand to hand. Elena's family shared stories of winters past, while Abby listened intently, her hand occasionally finding Jonas's beneath the table. After the meal, they sang hymns together, first in English, then in Ute, the melodies weaving together like the patterns in Elena's blankets. The sound drifted up to the rafters, making the cabin feel larger somehow, more blessed. Outside, snow began falling again, thick white flakes drifting past the windows. The afternoon light turned golden, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Jonas stood slowly, his presence drawing all eyes to him. He looked at Abby, his expression soft with emotion rarely shown. "You needed a home," he said, his voice steady and clear. "I needed a wife." He paused, reaching for Abby's hand. "Turns out we both needed each other more than we knew." Abby's eyes shone with unshed tears as she took his offered hand, her fingers intertwining with his. Kalina smiled knowingly, touching her grandson's shoulder as they watched the moment unfold. Beyond the cabin walls, the valley lay peaceful under its blanket of snow. The spring bubbled beneath its coating of ice, protected now by both law and love. The land that had drawn them together stretched white and pristine to the horizon, a promise of their shared future as secure as the foundations of their home. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.